So if you're new to learning CSS, you probably would have heard of CSS3, maybe not heard of CSS2 or 1 or anything like that. But we're going to clear up the sort of buzzword CSS3 in this video and just take a moment to explain what it is and how CSS versioning and things like vendor prefixes work. So the fundamentals of CSS are the fact that different browsers have different ways of displaying CSS. So let's say Chrome has WebKit or uses WebKit, as does Safari, and Firefox, I can't recall the name, but will use something else. So different browsers use different ways of showing CSS on the page. So it's not a globally sort of supported, harmonious thing. So when you go ahead and start learning CSS, you'll see things like this is a CSS3 property, this is a CSS2 property, or whatever. But basically what happens with CSS versioning or features or anything like that, if you like, is they are proposed. So the W3, the World Wide Web Consortium, will basically, or the W3C, will basically the ability to submit a request, if you like, or a feature. Let's say you want the ability to let's say you want a new grid system, or so that's where things like Flexbox comes in, or CSS grid systems come in. So you go ahead and submit a proposal and blah blah blah. It goes through lots of different stages, and then it starts to get implemented into the different browsers. So browsers will implement it in their own way initially, and that's where vendor prefixes come in. So CSS3 is basically a continuation of the different versionings of CSS, but you can still use older elements. Things get deprecated, as you would, in all sort of programming languages, if you like. But CSS3 will, give you sort of new features than when we move on, say, to eventually CSS4, depending on when you're watching this video, you'll have new features, but new things are added all the time. So it doesn't mean that if a CSS3 feature is not available in Internet Explorer, it could be available in Chrome or Firefox or something like that. So that's basically how the versioning of it works. So in this button example, we've actually used a CSS3 feature, and we can go ahead and add another CSS3 feature to this if you want. And these are introduced as let's talk about the drop shadow first. So you can see that there's a slight drop shadow on this button just behind the text, and if we click on this element, we can see that there's this text shadow property here. Now what that does is obviously applies a text shadow. There's lots of different ways you can use this, so the left, right, or the XY coordinates, the spread and the color and things like that, but we'll look at that later on in the series. So basically, this is a CSS3 property, so it's added in CSS3. It's supported across pretty much all of the major browsers, I think from IE9 above as well. But basically, this shadow has been added or proposed by someone simply because it gives a nice effect within the browser. It's fast to load, and it basically means there's no need to import an image into here. So traditionally, if you wanted a shadow, you'd have to bring in this text, maybe with a transparent background and a shadow, or you'd have to have this entire button as an image, which is inconvenient, because if you wanted to go ahead and change the text, with an image, you're going to have to load up, whatever you're using to edit images with, change the text, re-export the image, perhaps upload it to your web server. With this, we can just use CSS to change things like the shadow. Let's say we wanted the shadow to be slightly darker. We can do all of this. This is a CSS3 property. That's why I'm discussing it. Now, if, for example, you have a CSS property that isn't supported globally or harmoniously across browsers, you have things called vendor prefixes, and they look a little bit like this. So, for example, with text shadow, we may want to add a vendor prefix for WebKit. We may want to add a vendor prefix for Microsoft, and this would be just something. We'll just set it to 0. And we also might have something like Moz, for example, so for Mozilla. Notably, you'd probably recognize that as Firefox. And then you would probably go ahead and supply the non-vendor prefixed property as well. So basically, when new features are brought out, if they are not supported or implemented exactly the same across browsers, you'll need to use the vendor prefixes. Now, CSS3, as sort of I've already mentioned, isn't a new version that you install or you upgrade to, or isn't particularly supported for people that haven't done the same. With browsers like Chrome and Firefox, these are automatically updated. So what will happen is, with their builds that they release, these will automatically be updated and installed on users' computers. So if, for example, you say, oh, hold on a minute, the border radius property sounds really good. This is another feature, CSS3 property, that allows you to create radius for the border corners. So, for example, I might say I want this at 3 pixels. What this now does is it will round off the corners for you really nicely. So you can see now that, this looks really nice. It almost looks like an image on the page. But if you are worried about using this, it doesn't matter, because if the property isn't supported, it will simply be ignored, and that user will then be served with something with harsher edges. So it doesn't really matter too much about experimenting with different properties, as long as it's doing it for enhancement and not for a functional purpose. It doesn't have to be, it's not absolutely required. So basically, we've looked at 2 CSS3 properties. We've understood sort of how CSS versioning works, if you like. There is a lot more to this, a lot more than it to this. So if you head over to W3C, you can go ahead and read up, the different proposals and see their status. And this is a really great way to keep up with different versionings and different properties that are being proposed and implemented into different browsers. But yeah, that's basically what CSS3 is and how CSS versioning works.